morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tony Stewart, the coordinator of the Untitled College Popcorn Forum, and I want to say to all of you that for us that have been involved this week, it's been thrilling to have such intellectual speakers to share so much and to make it easier for us, we hope, to deal with our conflicts in the future that we will be having. I personally have been so assisted and helped in trying to go forward to deal with some things because of these outstanding speakers. I also want to say that the selection of the panel members, I think, has been excellent. The panel has been very, very informative in the afternoon, and for you who have not been in the panel forums yet, I would really invite you to come because they are really, really good, and you get to participate and learn a lot of that process. And for you who have taken an hour out of your life or 2 hours each day this week, you are very wise to do so. And for those who don't, they're not going to have some of the information that you have. I would like, before introducing the person hosting today, to indicate to you that after our speech today and the question period, our guest will have to leave about 11:15 to go do a television program, and that she will be present this afternoon at 1:30 in the bond room of the Student Union for the panel. I would bring to your attention that also tomorrow we shall continue this process at 11 a.m., but tomorrow we will not meet here. We will meet at the bond room for the speech at 11 in the morning in the Student Union building rather than here. This will be our last function in this particular building. And then after the speech at 11 tomorrow, there'll be a panel at 1:30 in the afternoon. And then on Friday, it's going to be a very exciting day to take all this information we've heard all week and to engage in what we call a town meeting on Friday in the morning, permitting you to speak out. And in the afternoon, we're going to talk about some of the principles of training to deal with negotiations and particular mediation. That would just be a simple introduction. This fall, we hope to have a grant where we'll do training sessions. It's my pleasure to introduce to you a very, very longtime friend and a dear friend who will facilitate and moderate all the town meeting on Friday. She has worked with the television program for 17 years, and she's been supported with the Popcorn Forum for 20 years. My very dear friend, Idaho State Senator Mary Reed. It gives me pleasure to introduce to you the person hosting today, a friend of mine, a member, a colleague on the faculty at North College and director of the Child Center at North College, to take you through the day, Carol Lindsay.
Good morning. Over the course of the last 2 days, we've heard some various discussions on some fairly serious critical issues that are going to be facing all of us as we enter the 1990s. We've had quite a bit of discussion on the family, the direction the family is going, the single-parent family, the blended family, working families, and the stresses associated with all of those. We've also talked about some very serious societal issues, drug and alcohol abuse, violence, crime, and all of which point to the need for becoming good negotiators and communicators. Well, all of us are facing these issues somehow, either personally or on a community-wide level. Our school system and our education system is dealing with these issues quite directly. At the same time, our schools are confronting issues. They are also becoming more accountable for issues that used to be solely family ones. Physical care of children is slowly being expanded into the schools, and we've seen this reflected in our very own school district here in Coeur d'Alene, where we are right now working on implementing a before and after school child care program for working families. We're also looking at increasing accountability for the schools in the area of psychological well-being and intellectual achievement in an era that is increasingly becoming more technological. Given all of these, as we're progressing through this transition and we're moving towards having to work more closely with families and with schools, we are naturally facing a certain amount of harmony in blending functions, as well as a certain amount of discord. A recent one that sort of rocked our community was the controversy over the Impressions textbook series. Today, Sherry McGee Banks will be discussing education as society, coercion, or partnership. Ms. Banks is the president of Educational Materials and Services Centers, which is a resource and information center for educational curriculum. The The center also has a national board. Cherry Banks holds a BS degree from Michigan State and an MA degree from Seattle University, where she's also currently working on her doctoral degree. Ms. Banks is an educational specialist at the Seattle Public Schools and a staff associate with the Citizens Education Center Northwest, which is known as Project Access. She also conducts numerous lectures and workshops addressing a wide variety of issues such as increasing academic achievement of minority students, education in plural society, and children's literature. She's published a number of articles on multicultural education. Cherry McGee Banks is the publisher of Multicultural Leader and a consultant for Equity House, which is in West Hartford, Connecticut. She's a member and chair of the Shoreline Community College Board of Trustees and is also a member of the Trustees Association of Community Colleges. So I'd like very pleased to introduce Cherry McGee Banks.
Thank you very much, Carol, for that very kind introduction. My only regret is that my 2 teenage daughters weren't here to hear what you had to say. For those of you who have teenagers, you know that there's nothing more humbling than having a teenager in your home. In all seriousness, however, I would like to say that I'm very honored to be with you today and very pleased that I've been invited here to the North Idaho College Symposium on Conflict, Hostility, or Harmony. And I look forward to sharing my perspectives and my vision for resolving dysfunctional conflict and using education as a bridge to a more harmonious society. Now, my references to conflict today will be primarily to dysfunctional conflict. Conflict in and of itself is not a negative concept. Conflict can be positive when it raises issues that need to be discussed, challenges ideas that need to be addressed, and pushes for needed changes. And so as we talk about conflict, some of the issues that I will be discussing with you today will be issues that will very likely involve a degree of conflict, but I don't think that they necessarily have to be dysfunctional conflict. Conflict occurs within an environment where there is a lack of trust and a lack of communication. And if we can build trust and we can build bridges of communication, we can, to some extent, limit the amount of dysfunctional conflict. Dysfunctional conflict does not lead to positive resolutions of different perspectives. Instead, it leads to a widening of differences and an intensification of conflict. The educational issues that we'll be talking about today involve change, and change inevitably involves conflict. And I hope that my comments today will give you a better understanding why educational conflicts are occurring today and ways that we can effectively address them. I also hope that this session will find a basis for renewing and motivating you as you work on some of these issues, and that you will leave this session with your commitments to human justice and equality reaffirmed. I'd like to just take a minute to congratulate Tony Stewart and the other conference sponsors for keeping hope alive in these times that try our souls. These are very difficult times, and I think this kind of a conference is very important, and the people that have the vision and have the skills and are willing to commit the time to bringing people together should be congratulated. We're living in times when many conservative forces are turning back the carriage on the road to justice, but we must not turn back. Our survival depends on us moving forward on the road to justice, equality, and a more humane world. As Martin Luther King stated, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I'm also reminded of a poem entitled The Hangman, and a line of that poem is, "If they come for me in the morning, they will come for you in the afternoon." Perhaps America's richest gift to the rest of the world will be to show that racial and ethnic harmony can work, and that the relatively affluent 85% of our society can lift the 15% who remain poor, often despondently so. Now, this will require a deeper sense of community, more Americans working together with values that are inclusive, nurturing, and caring, as opposed to the conflict that we're currently seeing, which represents conflict related to competition, to individualistic concerns, and to selfish concerns. We must get on with the work of building a society that is open, diverse, pluralistic, free, and a society that is non-racist and non-sexist, and believes in equality of opportunity, not simply equality of results. My major thesis today is that multicultural education and multicultural literacy is needed for our survival and is needed to resolve the conflicts that we see in our society today. This is not simply survival for people of color and for people from various cultures and religious groups, but for our national and global survival in this very rapidly changing world. Martin Luther King stated, "We will live together as brothers and sisters, or we will die apart as strangers." And we often talk about students who are at risk, but actually we are a nation and a world at risk. We are all at risk if we do not create a just and humane society, a society in which the voices of all groups are heard and validated, and in which all individuals are empowered. Racism, sexism, and the other isms continue to exist because they reinforce dominant group power relationships in our society. Racism and sexism will not be reduced until the power relationships that perpetuate and reinforce them are changed, and education is the vehicle for bringing about that change. We must restructure our institutions, and this is particularly pertinent for educational institutions, to accommodate some of the new demographic changes that are occurring in our society. And I call these demographic changes the demographic imperative. And here are some of the facts related to the demographic imperative. 1, by the turn of the century, 1 out of 3 Americans will be a person of color. 2, students of color are majorities in 25 of the nation's 50 largest school districts. Teachers of color are expected to decline from 12.5% of the nation's teachers in 1980 to 5% by the turn of the century. And just think of the implications for this. We have school districts that are becoming more and more populated by students of color, and the teaching force in those districts is becoming more and more represented by people who are not from those groups. Point number 3, over 51% of California public school students are students of color. California is our nation's largest state. About 30 million people live in that state, and currently most of the students who attend public school in the state of California are students of color. You will notice that I've used the term students of color and people of color, and the reason for that is that we need new concepts and new terms for referring to people who were in the past referred to as minorities, and those groups represent African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans. And the reason is that the concept minority is inaccurate and it's misleading. We need new terms that will help us grapple with the new demographic realities that are occurring in our society. And people of color may not be the best term to use, but it's a word that's a little more accurate and a little more descriptive than minority. And it's currently increasingly being used in the literature. And so you will see that term used more and more. Point number 4, between 1981 and 1986, 89% of the legal immigrants to the United States came from non-European nations, and only 11% came from Europe. Most of the legal immigrants came from Asia, and this represented about 47%. And then 38% came from Latin America. About 600,000 legal and about 200,000 illegal immigrants enter the United States each year. Now, by the turn of the century, about 80% of the new entrants into the labor force will be women, immigrants, and people of color. One important source of conflict occurs when we have heterogeneous groups coming together. Different languages, values, worldviews are all sources of potential conflict, and it's essential that the schools help prepare students to be effective citizens in a multicultural society. In 1982, about 73% of the school-age population was white. Now, this year, the school-age population will decline to approximately 54.5% by the year 2020. In contrast, in 1982, Hispanics constituted 9.3% of the 0 to 17-year-olds in the population. By the year 2020, the Hispanic proportion of the population will be about 25.3%. The dramatic changes in that population will be reflected in the kinds of things that schools will have to address. Whereas almost 3 in 4 children in 1982 were white, only about 1 in 2 children will be white by the year 2020. And whereas only 1 in 10 children in 1982 were Hispanic, by 2020, 1 in 4 will be Hispanic. The number of children in poverty will also change. In 1984, the number of children in poverty were 14.7 million. By 2020, that number will increase to 20.1 million, and that's an increase of 37%. The number of children speaking languages other than English will increase from 2 million in 1982 to 6 million in 2020. And that's almost tripling the number of students who speak a language other than English as their primary language. Students who drop out of school cost the nation approximately $50 billion in their lifetime of foregone earnings. This is a cost to our nation that's also reflected in the kinds of things that the schools have to address. All of these statistics represent the demographic imperative, and these are all areas of potential conflict. Conflict that's represented in these demographics, however, does not have to be dysfunctional conflict. To accommodate these new demographic realities, our institutions, particularly our schools, and the rest of the institutions that relate to schools, such as the world of work, must be restructured. And by restructuring, I mean that a fundamental examination of the goals, values, and purposes of institutions and a re-examination of their purposes must take place. When restructuring occurs, the total system is recognized as the problem, and incremental changes are viewed as insufficient as a reform strategy. We need transformational leaders in order to resolve conflict in our society and to restructure institutions so that they can respond effectively to the demographic imperative and to our world economy that's changing very rapidly. Transformational leaders are individuals who have a vision that they use to mobilize people to action. Now, this is in contrast to transactional leadership. Transactional leadership is a quid pro quo type of leadership. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Transactional leadership, which is pervasive within educational institutions and the larger society, does not motivate people to action. Rather, it causes alienation, discontentedness, and the syndrome, this too shall pass. And so as you implement new programs in schools, many of the individuals who are staff members in the schools and even people who are in the community often feel that if they wait long enough and they are not actively involved in implementing the program, that eventually that program will pass and they will be able to return to business as usual. Many people in our schools and colleges and universities are waiting for multicultural education to pass. And it has hung on for a number of years, and I'm predicting that it will continue to hang on because of the demographic imperatives that I have stated earlier. Most people are not finding very much meaning in their lives. And this is not only true for people who work in schools, but also people who work in other industries, such as IBM, Boeing, and General Motors. In a recent article, Peter Drucker stated that many workers find very little meaning in their work. They're volunteering after work in order to do something meaningful, and they're working in community groups, churches, and other nonprofit organizations. And I think that that's an area that schools can build on. We need to restructure our schools, colleges, and universities around the vision of caring, commitment, and humane action. And multicultural education and the multicultural vision provide such an opportunity for mobilizing action. Many of our citizens are immobilized into inaction. Edmund Burke stated, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Now you might ask, why should educational institutions help future citizens and workers to develop multicultural literacy, cross-cultural skills, and increase the achievement of students of color? Well, there are two major reasons why this should occur. The first reason is that we need to develop a more caring and humane nation. And the second reason is that we must do it in order to survive as a democratic nation in a global, interconnected society. I'm going to first discuss the issue of developing a more caring and humane society, and then share with you some ideas on why I think it's necessary for us to implement multicultural education in order to survive as a democratic nation. Horace Mann, in his commencement address at Antioch College in 1859, said, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for mankind." I think if man were alive today, he would say humankind, but in that day he said mankind. We need to seriously reflect on the meaning and the purpose of our lives. And we need a vision to guide our lives and our moral commitments. The Bible says somewhere that where there is no vision, the people will perish. And our nation is threatened today, not by Russia or from some other foreign power, but by a lack of vision. Editors of Time magazine, in an article entitled, "Is the Government Dead?" wrote, "Unwilling to lead, politicians are letting America slip into paralysis." We must educate the hearts as well as the minds of our students and help them to acquire a humane vision. The school, college, and university curriculum should help students develop multicultural literacy and knowledge and skills and commitment to act to improve the human condition. We're living in times that try men's souls. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is widening in our society, and we're rapidly becoming two nations, one rich and one poor. The growing number of homeless individuals who are seeking refuge in our decaying cities is multiplying by the day. One of the areas that multicultural education can help with is to give students a clearer understanding of the issues that we are grappling with. Poverty is an important issue for them to understand. Poverty is not an issue or a problem that is exclusive to people of color, and yet if you turn on your TV and watch the evening news, you rarely see or hear about poverty outside of a community populated by people of color. Over 10% of whites in America live below the poverty line. That percentage is lower than the percentages in populations of people of color. However, because of the size of the population of whites, it represents an incredibly large number of people. That 10% represents 21.4 million people who are living below the poverty level. In fact, whites are the largest single group of people living in poverty in terms of any particular racial group. And this is despite the media images. The poor who are white are often voiceless and invisible, and they do not have a spokesperson. The percentage of people of color who are living in poverty is much higher than 10%. It's 30% for Hispanics and represents about 5.7 million people, and 40% for African Americans, representing about 12 million people. However, as you can see, it is an issue that is a problem for people in all ethnic groups. And multicultural education can help students to understand that issues such as poverty are not issues that are simply related to one particular group of people. And education is also a vehicle that can be used to help young people who are living in poverty today to break the cycle of poverty. Unfortunately, fewer and fewer poor youths and youths of color are making it to our colleges and universities. The percentage of low-income African Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 going to college declined from 39.8% in 1976 to 30.3% in 1988. And the percentage of low-income Hispanics in college declined from 50.4% to 35.3% from 1976 to 1988. I recently read an article in the New York Times that indicates that the number of students of color attending universities is increasing, and that's a hopeful note. However, we must also build into that vehicles that will help retain them when they're in college. So I think there is some reason for hope now, but we cannot look at those kinds of increases and assume that things have changed dramatically. 1 out of 3 PhDs awarded in natural sciences and engineering in 1988 went to foreigners, and this is compared to 1 out of 4 in 1977. Time magazine wrote, "The science deficit threatens America's prosperity and possibly even its national security." As we look at what's happening in the natural sciences and engineering, and you think about the demographics that I shared with you, it's very clear that women and people of color will have to enter scientific fields in greater numbers if we are to meet the scientific challenges of the next century. However, despite these ominous developments, many Americans have lost their commitment to the public good and have retreated into a sense of narcissism, and they're seemingly unaware of the interconnected nature of our society. And that's one of the major problems that I think we face today, is that we have so many people who are in a position to help and to be factors that will assist in bringing about change, and because their lives and the people that they know are not affected immediately by some of these changes, they don't recognize it as a major problem. But I hope today, as you listen to some of these statistics that I'm sharing with you, that you realize that we are all in this together, and that we are not a separate group pitting our various interests against each other, but ultimately our interest is one interest, and that is the improvement of our society and the education of all of the children of the society. And that brings me to my second point for why educational institutions should help future citizens to develop multicultural literacy, cross-cultural skills, and increase the academic achievement of students of color. And that reason is for our survival as a nation. In the boom years of the 1950s, 17 workers supported each retiree. By 1992, the ratio will be 3 workers to 1 retiree, with one of those workers, one of the 3 workers, being a person of color. By 2030, the ratio will have narrowed to 2.2 workers to 1 retiree. And if that present trend continues, one of those 2.2 workers depended on for your and my retirement could very well be undereducated and on welfare. PBS, in a series entitled Learning in America, pointed out that a major insurance company was sending its paperwork to Dublin each week because the skills of the Irish workers were so much better than the skills of American workers. Now, this was being done at a time when Black teenagers were experiencing unemployment rates that were about 30 to 40% in some cities. This points out the interconnected aspect of our global economy. We have entered a one-world economy. The New York Times, Sunday, May 28, 1999, said U.S. companies are in a global war for their survival. Foreign investment in the U.S. climbed from $90 billion in 1980 to $304.2 billion last year. And Buy American, which is something that you hear frequently as an attempt to fortress and build up the American economy has become increasingly meaningless. It's very difficult to find anything that's exclusively made in America. And so if you can buy American, that's wonderful, but unfortunately, most of the things that are available to us are not manufactured in America exclusively. We live in a global world economy, and multinational corporations, as they used to be called, has become quickly a misnomer. Corporations are not attached to a specific nation. They are transnational. One of the things that I thought was very interesting as I was reading Fortune magazine, I noted that Fortune magazine is one of the periodicals that I subscribe to, and they do an excellent job of providing information to the business community that reflects some of these changing demographics. And they had an article on Japan and U.S. information about Japan that I think fits in very nicely to what I'm talking about today in terms of educating students to be critical thinkers and to understand the realities of the world that we live in. Many people who live in the United States have endorsed and adopted myths and half-truths about the Japanese. Some of the more common ones are the Japanese can buy Rockefeller Center, but Westerners can't own property in Tokyo. However, the reality is that Coca-Cola, IBM, Eastman Kodak, and a number of other large companies that are U.S. owned have about $1 billion worth of property in Japan. A number of American citizens who are living in Japan also own homes. And so it's important to understand how that particular perspective fits in with reality. Another point that is sometimes made is that Sony takes over CBS Records and Columbia Pictures, but foreigners can't acquire Japanese companies. Now, it's true that companies in Japan don't change hands as rapidly as they do here in the United States, and that they're often held within families. And hostile takeovers are very rare, unlike the United States. However, Ford owns 24% of Mazda, Chrysler owns 11% of a major Japanese auto company, and foreign investors own about 14% of Sony. Japanese auto plants in the United States merely assemble parts made in Japan is another point that you hear sometimes. It's important to note in that regard that the Japanese assembly plants that are located in the United States are increasing the amount of production that's done here, and it's expected to rise to approximately 67% this year. However, U.S. automakers are importing more and more parts from foreign nations, and Mexico and various other foreign plants that they own are becoming more and more important and increasingly a part of the production of the American-owned auto plants. So this is a very complicated issue, and students need to understand the interconnected aspects of our global society and also understand the importance of dealing with these issues on a very sophisticated, in-depth way, and not merely accepting surface analysis to understand these complex issues. The reality is that direct investment in the United States by the end of 1988 was $304.2 billion, and Japan represented only 16% of that. The Netherlands represented 17%, and Great Britain 29%. The other was divided between West Germany, France, and various other countries. Our future as a society will depend on our ability to educate all of the children in this nation. And to do that, we must raise our level of expectation for poor students and minority students or students of color. Now, this is very important because traditionally within our schools, we have adopted a variety of excuses and reasons why these students were not achieving. And I am submitting to you today that these students can achieve, and it will be in our interests to make sure that they do achieve. And one of the things that we're going to have to do is change our level of expectation for them. Rosenthal, Jacobson, Riss, and other researchers have indicated that when people have high expectations of individuals, that expectation is followed by reality. In other words, if we expect students to achieve highly, they will achieve. I'm not saying that high expectations are sufficient. They are necessary. They are very necessary, but they are not sufficient for high academic achievement. We must also provide students with the means and the conditions necessary for high academic achievement. And there are a number of things that can be covered here. I'm going to talk just a little bit about one of the important things, and that is the Periculum. Now, someone defines school history as the agreed upon myths taught to school children. And while perhaps this is an exaggeration, this statement does reveal the way in which knowledge in schools and universities is often reinforces the status quo and justifies the position of those who are in power. And it makes students who are not a part of the power structure content with their social status and politically passive. And it achieves these goals in several ways. One of the important ways that it does that is that the images and words that are used and the value statements that are presented to students are presented as facts. For example, the British colonists are called settlers and pioneers, but people from other nations are called immigrants. By calling the British immigrants settlers and pioneers, textbook authors subtly suggest that the Indian nations which had existed here for about 45,000 years in the Americas did not exist, and their existence is effectively denied in the minds of students. Another way that this occurs is by calling the Americas the New World and stating that Columbus discovered America. We also have some problems in the area of American history, suggesting that American history did not begin until the Europeans arrived, and telling the story of U.S. history from the point of view of Europeans. The curriculum becomes Eurocentric, and an example of this is in a very typical chapter in most American history books, a chapter entitled The Westward Movement. If we think about that for a while, we realize that it was the European immigrants who were moving west. It was not the Sioux. They were already in the West. And from the point of view of the Sioux, the chapter entitled The Western Movement might better be entitled The Age of Doom or The Great Invasion. The Sioux considered their home the center of the universe and not the West. And it's important for students to understand the different perspectives that are involved in issues such as the Westward Movement. Indians are often presented as unreasonable and hostile when their homes were taken. And this is a very common theme that is not only in American history books, but it's also presented in the media and presented in children's literature. And so that image is reinforced in various aspects of our society. The term restive is a very interesting term. My family and I are from the Seattle, Washington area, and we often visit the Olympic Peninsula. And while visiting that part of the state, we went to a national park, a state park, and visited a U.S. Army post that was established at a particular site there in 1856. And there was a statement written about that post. And it stated, in the mid-19th century, the growth of Port Townsend caused Indians to become restive. Settlers started a home guard, campaigned wherever called, and defeated the Indians in the Battle of Seattle. Indians rebelled as the government began enforcing the Indian Treaty of 1854, by which the Indians had ceded most of their territory. Port Townsend, a prosperous port of entry on Puget Sound, then asked for the U.S. Army for protection. And I think that statement sums up the point of view that is very common in our society. And that was posted without, I'm sure, any thought that there were some very contradictory things included. The Indians became restive, and there was no reason why they should have become restive. I'm sure you would not become restive if someone invaded your home and tried to take over. The Indians had ceded most of their territory. There was no thought to, perhaps they did not believe that that was a legal, decent, right thing to do. And as a result, they began to rebel. There was no reason for them to rebel. We need to begin to take a look at some of these issues and to help students to critically analyze them. The U.S. school and college curriculum in the areas of the sciences, the humanities, the arts, and in other disciplines is often Eurocentric. In addition, it's also male-centric. It focuses primarily on mainstream males with power. And this is one of the areas that I think we have to also pay attention to. The history of women and people of color is often written out of our history books or marginalized because European American males with power have formulated a canon or a criteria of what is important in history, literature, and the arts. Now, a canon is a norm, criterion, model, or standard that's used for evaluating or criticizing. And for those of you who read the New York Times and some of the other periodicals that cover some educational issues, you will know that the battle over the canon is currently one of the major issues that is going on in universities. And that is an attempt on the part of students of color and women to infuse the university liberal arts curriculum with information, perspectives that give a broader understanding of the American experience. In history, the canon indicates that the only important events that should be recorded and discussed are events that relate to military and political history. Other kinds of history, such as social history, the history of common men and women, and family history, are all considered much less important. And thus, military and political history dominate most history books. The kinds of history in which women and people of color have participated in, however, is not military or political history, and therefore they are effectively excluded from the curriculum. I'm arguing today that the curriculum must be transformed, and to do that, we have to reconceptualize the history and the culture of the United States so that it reflects the experiences and perspectives of its diverse people. Such a curriculum will empower students rather than making them politically passive and alienated. We need to transform the curriculum so that literature by women and people of color become part of what is considered classic and needed to help make us more humane and more reflective individuals. Langston Hughes, Maxine Hung, Kingston, Toni Morrison should be studied along with John Steinbeck and Edgar Allan Poe. Helping students to become reflective, critical, social actors will also help make our society more decent and humane. We must teach students that they must not only think, but that they must also be prepared to act. And that many of the myths and fictions that they encounter, not only in textbooks, but in the media and in magazines and newspapers, will reinforce the negative, limited perspective of our society. Statements by politicians, television, and other medias that are current today are an unfortunate but a very cogent testimony to the extent to which our educational system has tragically failed to teach all of our citizens to think critically about our world and our society. In summary, I've identified and discussed what I've called the demographic imperative and the battle over the canon, and the need for curriculum reform as three major areas of potential conflict in our educational system. I've identified and discussed multicultural education as a vehicle for resolving conflict. And I'd just like to recap 3 key issues in multicultural teaching that I've covered. The first is content issues, using examples from different cultures to teach key ideas, concepts, principles, in various disciplines for subject areas. For example, my daughter, who has had an opportunity to read Carl Sandburg, one of my favorite poets, for a number of years in her K-12 educational experience, has never had an opportunity to read Gwendolyn Brooks. and it's in our home that we have exposed her to the works of Gwendolyn Brooks and other such individuals. The schools must begin to take a look at the content that is being used in the schools and make sure that that content represents examples from different cultures, and that those, the representation of the various cultures can be used to teach key ideas, concepts, and principles that are basic to the various disciplines. The second point is knowledge, and here we're talking about knowledge construction, helping students to understand and investigate and determine how implicit cultural assumptions, perspectives, and biases influence knowledge construction in the various disciplines. I talked about the chapter in history books entitled The Westward Movement. Students in this area would look at the voices of the pioneers and settlers who were Europeans, as they're called in the history books. They would also have an opportunity to look at the voices and hear the voices of the Sioux who were living in the West at that time. They would have an opportunity to mesh that and to consider their perspectives on that and understand how knowledge is actually constructed. And the third area is what I'm calling inequity pedagogy. And this exists when teachers modify their instruction to facilitate the academic achievement of students from diverse racial, cultural, and ethnic and gender groups. And this is really essential to the ability of the United States to enter the 21st century as an effective nation. When I talked about the number of people that we have in our nation currently entering the sciences and engineering, and stated that we must, if we are going to have a population of individuals who will assist our nation in dealing with the rapid technological changes that are occurring, have women and people of color enter those fields. It is an equity pedagogy that will assist that in occurring. In closing, I would like to say that the heart of education in the future will be our ability to teach all of the children of our nation and to teach them to think critically. James Baldwin, in a speech to a group of New York City teachers in 1963, the speech was entitled "A Talk to Teachers," said, "The purpose of education, finally, is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself, this is black, this is white, to decide for himself whether there is a God, heaven, or not, to ask questions of the universe, and then to live with those questions in the way that he or she has decided that they will live." But no society is really anxious to have that sort of person around. What society really wants, and ideally wants, is a citizenry that will simply obey the rules of society. He warns, however, if a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. Conflict and change is an inevitable part of the educational process. Our jobs as educators is to create an environment where trust and communication can exist. Multicultural education is a vehicle to such an environment. And as we move forward to create such an environment, let us remember an old Turkish proverb: no matter how far you've gone down the wrong road, turn back. Thank you.